The evening Charlotte Ashby spoke her name aloud in Charles Murphy's drawing room. The fire in the grate had been burning for 3 hours, and the room smelled of beeswax candles and cold ambition. 14 people sat arranged across the cream and gilt furniture that Murphy had purchased from a bankrupt viscount 4 years prior, and every one of them turned at the sound of her voice. She did not raise it. She did not need to. The words carried because the room had gone entirely still, and because Lord Edmund Reeves, Earl of Vance, was already crossing the Aubusson carpet toward her in 3 measured strides, and the rustle of his movement made everything else stop. That was the night the hierarchy rendered its verdict, and then unmade it, in the same room, before the same witnesses. But Charlotte had arrived at Murphy's Wiltshire estate 6 weeks earlier with nothing more than a worn leather trunk, 2 dresses suitable for domestic work, and a debt of £240 that her mother had left behind when she died in the autumn of 1812. She had trained as a governess. She had spent 3 years in a respectable household in Bath, teaching the daughters of a solicitor to read French and play simple pieces on the pianoforte, and she had believed, in the way that young women of limited means sometimes permit themselves to believe, that she had secured a foothold that would hold. It did not hold. The solicitor's household dissolved in debt of its own, and the agency in London that handled governess placements informed Charlotte, with professional regret, that positions were scarce and competition considerable. What they had, if she was willing, was a housemaid's post in Wiltshire. The estate was called Grasmere Park. The employer was a Mr. Charles Murphy, a merchant of considerable recent fortune who had acquired the property in 1805 and was engaged in what the agency described, carefully, as the process of establishing himself in county society. Charlotte was willing. £240 of inherited debt made her willing to carry a great number of things she would not otherwise have chosen. She arrived in the first week of October, when the elms along the drive had gone entirely gold, and the morning air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. The housekeeper, a practical woman named Mrs. Gould, showed her to a small room at the back of the upper floor, gave her a linen apron and a brief list of her duties, and said nothing unkind. Charlotte was grateful for that. She set her trunk in the corner, smoothed the apron over her dress, and carried herself downstairs. Murphy himself she saw that first evening, crossing the hall toward his study, a broad man in his late 50s with a merchant's deliberate energy and the beginnings of a gentleman's wardrobe. He had gray at his temples and clever eyes, and he did not look at her directly. He looked past her, in the way that men of new fortune sometimes looked past the people who kept their houses running, as if domestics existed primarily in the periphery. Lady Dorothea Finch arrived 2 days later with a carriage, a lady's maid, and an air of ownership that the house had done nothing to earn. She was a dowager of the old school, still sharp at 60, with jewels that had survived 2 husbands and a manner cultivated across decades to protect precisely the kind of social order that Charlotte's careful speech and straight spine threatened without intending to. She swept into the entrance hall and looked Charlotte over with the particular economy of a woman who had learned to assess a person in the time it took to remove a glove. "Where is she from?" Lady Finch asked Mrs. Gould, as though Charlotte were a piece of furniture whose provenance needed checking. "Wiltshire agency, my lady. Previously with a solicitor's household in Bath." "A solicitor's household." Lady Finch smoothed the second glove into her reticule with a small, satisfied motion. "Well, at least she will not have ideas above her station." Charlotte kept her eyes level and her hands still at her sides. She did not respond because she had learned, in 30 months of reduced circumstances, that certain rooms required a silence she did not have to feel. The dismissive label had been fastened. "A presumptuous provincial," Lady Finch told Murphy at dinner that evening, voice carrying through the gap in the dining room door that Charlotte happened to be passing. A girl with a governess's airs and a maid's prospects. One must be careful, she added, about giving such women reason to forget which one they were. Charlotte carried the supper tray to the kitchen and said nothing to Agnes, who was filling a water jug at the sideboard and watching her with the particular careful attention of a person who had learned to read rooms by what was not said in them. Agnes was 22 and had worked at Grasmere Park for 4 years. She had brown eyes and a practical kindness that she distributed without ceremony, and she had, within Charlotte's first week, demonstrated a quality Charlotte had rarely encountered in domestic service. She noticed things and kept what she noticed to herself, unless the person she had noticed it about needed to hear it. Lady Finch took tea in the west sitting room for 2 hours, Agnes said, not quite looking up from the jug. She and Murphy were at it about the county assembly. I heard your name. Charlotte set the tray down. Was it flattering? Agnes considered this with the gravity it deserved. Not precisely. Charlotte permitted herself one quiet breath of something very close to wry acknowledgement, and then she picked up the lamp and went to bed. She had been at Grasmere Park for 11 days when she found the error in the household accounts. She had not been looking for it. Mrs. Gould had asked her, on the strength of a reference from the Bath solicitor's household that mentioned Charlotte's arithmetic, to check the quarterly linen tallies against the supplier's invoice. It was routine work, the kind of task assigned to whoever was literate and had time. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon, with the account book open beside her and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, and she found, in the column of figures relating to the wine merchant's most recent delivery, a discrepancy that should not have been there. £42, entered twice. The second entry carried a slightly different notation in the column header, as if someone had hoped the variation would obscure the repetition. It was the kind of error that accumulated slowly and paid out quietly to whoever had arranged it, and it was, if left uncorrected, precisely the kind of thing that would eventually cost Murphy considerably more than £42. Charlotte sat with the open book for a long moment. She considered what the discovery was worth. She considered what she could request for it, and how reasonable such a request would appear, given that she had been employed for 11 days, and had no standing, and owed £240 on a debt she had not incurred herself. She corrected the figure, noted the source of the discrepancy in a margin annotation, and left the account book on Mrs. Gould's desk with a brief written explanation and the original invoice clipped beside it. She requested nothing. She told no one except Agnes, who heard about it through Mrs. Gould and looked at Charlotte the following morning with an expression that had something respectful and slightly concerned in it. "You could have held that," Agnes said. "I know," Charlotte said. What she did not know was that the library at Grasmere Park was visible from the kitchen passage on the east side of the house, where a high window let onto the room's interior at an angle that was useful for ventilation and occasionally for something else. She had begun visiting the library before dawn. Not to take, only to read. Sitting in the window seat with whatever volume she had carried in under her apron, moving through a particular history of English common law that had caught her attention in the weeks before everything at the solicitor's household had collapsed. She left the books exactly as she found them. She left no evidence of herself. She came in the gray hour before the house woke, and she was gone, before the first footman lit the morning fires. On the fourth morning of her library visits, there was a small girl curled on the rug beside the cold hearth. Clara, the youngest of the kitchen girls, 9 years old, and running a fever that she had been hiding from Mrs. Gould for 2 days because she was afraid of being sent away. Charlotte found her there at 5:30 in the morning, shivering and awake, and sat down beside her on the floor without ceremony, wrapped the child in her own shawl, and read aloud from the English Common Law volume until the girl's shivering eased, and her eyes grew heavy, and the gray light outside the library windows went from pewter to pale gold. She did not hear the door. Edmund Reeves, Earl of Vance, had arrived the previous evening for a neighborly call that had extended, as such calls occasionally did at Grasmere Park, into an overnight stay. He was 36 years old, controlled in the way of a man who had learned control through disappointment, and he had come down early because he slept badly in houses that were not his own and had wanted a book. He stood in the library doorway for a long moment with the door half open, watching the maid on the floor with the sick child wrapped against her side, reading in a steady, unhurried voice about the legal definition of common land. He did not announce himself. He pulled the door closed and went quietly back to his room, and the thing that moved in his chest in that corridor was not something he named. Charlotte did not know he had been there. Murphy said something unforgivable about her 11 days after that. It was a morning gathering in the front parlor, the kind that Lady Finch arranged with the precision of a woman who understood that social infrastructure required regular maintenance. 3 other women from the county were present, the wives of 2 local landowners and a widowed baroness who had known Lady Finch since girlhood. Charlotte was carrying a tea tray. Murphy was telling a story about his recent correspondence with a London merchant, and the story required him to reproduce, for the company's amusement, the precise and careful locutions of a person who had learned to speak from books rather than birth. He did it in Charlotte's voice. Not quite in Charlotte's voice. He did not name her. He reproduced the cadence of her careful speech and the precision of her vocabulary and the quality of her attention to correct form, and he did it with the easy contempt of a man who found education in the wrong body an inherently comic spectacle. Lady Finch laughed. 2 of the visiting women smiled. The Baroness, Mrs. Calder, looked at the carpet. Charlotte set the tea tray down on the table beside the window and did not allow her hands to shake. She kept her face exactly as it needed to be kept. She turned and walked out of the room. Lord Vance had been standing at the window when Murphy began his performance, holding a teacup he had not yet raised to his lips. He had watched Murphy complete it, and something in his posture had shifted, very slightly, in a way that the assembled company did not observe, but that Mrs. Calder, who had been watching the room rather than the performer, noted and filed away. Charlotte learned about the shift from Agnes, who had been clearing the sideboard and had the particular advantage of being, as she put it, entirely invisible to most people in that room. He didn't say anything, Agnes told her, folding napkins with unnecessary precision. But he put the teacup down very slowly, like he was deciding something. Charlotte did not permit herself to read anything particular into this. She had been in domestic service long enough to know the difference between a man who was deciding to act and a man who was merely uncomfortable with someone else's vulgarity. The first was rare. The second was common enough to be mistaken for the first by women who needed it to be otherwise. She did not need it to be otherwise. She needed the debt reduced and her position maintained, and her daily work to remain what it was. She needed nothing from Lord Vance, Earl of Vance, whose profile at the window had resolved itself into something carved and still, like a face on a coin. It was Murphy himself who gave her reason to need something else entirely. She found the miniature in his study on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October, when she had been sent to dust the shelves while Murphy was out riding. It was small, set in a gilt oval frame no larger than her palm, pushed to the back of the 3rd shelf behind a copy of Johnson's dictionary. A woman of perhaps 22, painted with the precise economy of a skilled miniaturist, dark-haired and light-eyed, and carrying in the line of her jaw something Charlotte had spent her entire life seeing in mirrors. She stood with it in her hand for a long time. She had her mother's name and her mother's debt, and she had known, in the abstract way of a woman raised by silence on the subject, that there had been a father who had departed before her birth and had not returned. Miriam Ashby had never spoken his name. She had never written it down. Or if she had, Charlotte had not found the record. She had left behind the debt and the memory of a precise, careful intelligence that Charlotte had inherited like furniture. Useful, present, not chosen. The letters were in the same drawer that held the frame's velvet case, a bundle of 7, written in her mother's hand on thin paper, now gone brown at the folds. Charlotte sat down in Murphy's desk chair and read them in order, and the story they told was not a complicated one. A young merchant, newly prosperous and not yet settled, a woman he had left in Bristol when opportunity called him north, and then south, and then to Wiltshire, where he had built what he had built, and had never, not once in 30 years, sent word back. The last letter in the bundle was the one Miriam had written and never sent. It was addressed to a Mr. C. Murphy, Grasmere Park, Wiltshire. It bore the date of March 1789, 4 months before Charlotte was born. It said, in her mother's precise and careful hand, that she would not write again, and that she wished him well, and that she hoped the life he had built was worth what he had left behind. Charlotte folded the letters back along their existing creases and held them against her sternum for one long breath. Then she carried them, and the miniature, to her room, wrapped them in the spare flannel she kept in the bottom of her trunk, and locked it. She told Agnes that evening, because Agnes was there, and because there was no one else, and because some things needed to be said aloud to keep them from becoming too large to hold. Agnes sat on the edge of Charlotte's bed, and said nothing for a full minute. Then she said, "What will you do?" Charlotte considered this with the same precision she had brought to the linen tallies. She did not know yet what she would do. She knew what she would not do. She would not flee, because 240 pounds of debt made flight a luxury. She would not confront Murphy in private, because privacy would allow him to manage the confrontation in whatever way suited him best. She would not pretend she had not found the letters, because her mother had spent 30 years pretending, and had died with the letters still folded in a box beneath her winter clothes. "I don't know yet," she said. The decision was made for her 6 days later by Lady Finch. Lord Vance had returned to Grasmere Park for a dinner gathering, the first formal evening Murphy had attempted that season. 14 guests arranged across the candlelit dining room and then dispersed into the drawing room afterward for coffee and conversation. Charlotte was carrying the coffee service. She was moving between the small tables set for the purpose, and she was, as she had trained herself to be in such rooms, precisely invisible. Lady Finch spoke from the settee beside the fire, where she sat with the 2 landowners' wives and the confidence of a woman who had never found reason to lower her voice. "Mr. Murphy's little provincial," she said, with the precise warmth of someone identifying an amusing fixture. "I understand she fancies herself something of a scholar. Mrs. Gould tells me she was found in the library before dawn. Reading, of all things." The 2 wives tilted toward her like flowers following a specific light. "A housemaid in the library," Lady Finch continued, her voice carrying that studied gentleness that was its own form of violence. "I have told Mr. Murphy it will not do. One cannot have staff with unsuitable aspirations. It makes the other servants restless. I have recommended she be let go before Christmas." He was inclined to agree. Charlotte set the coffee cup down on the nearest table with perfect steadiness. She heard the words as a physical thing, the way one hears a bolt being drawn. Let go. Before Christmas. With the winter settling in and the agency closed until the new year and £240 still outstanding. She looked up and found Lord Vance's eyes from across the room. He was standing beside the bookcase, 3 feet from where Lady Finch sat, and he had heard every word. She read nothing in his face at that moment, nothing that she was willing to trust. His jaw was level, and his eyes were the color of deep water, and she did not know what lay beneath the surface of him, only that she had looked directly at him for the first time without flinching, and that something in his stillness had changed quality, very slightly, in a way she could not interpret. She returned her attention to the coffee service. She completed her circuit of the room. She set the last cup in its saucer, straightened the cloth on the side table, and turned toward the door. "I wonder," Lady Finch said, addressing the room more broadly now, enjoying the extension of the subject, "whether she understands the generosity that was extended in employing her at all. A governess's girl playing at service. One can only imagine what put her in that position to begin with." Charlotte stopped. She stopped because her feet stopped, because some mechanism beneath the level of decision had made the choice before she reached it. She stood with her back to the room for the space of 3 full heartbeats, and in those 3 heartbeats she thought of her mother's letters folded in the trunk upstairs, and of the miniature with her own jaw and her mother's eyes, and of Murphy's easy performance of her voice to a roomful of laughing women, and of the debt that had never been hers, and the position she had been promised, and the dismissal that Lady Finch had already arranged with the casualness of a woman swatting a fly. She turned around. Murphy was standing near the fireplace. He had gone a little red around the collar, the way men did when they were not quite comfortable with what was happening, but did not intend to stop it. Lady Finch was watching Charlotte with an expression of composed interest, faintly surprised that she had not left yet. The 14 guests in the room shifted, collectively, into a held attention. If you have stayed with Charlotte this far, you already know what courage costs a woman with nothing to fall back on. If this story has moved something in you, leave a word in the comments. It matters more than you might think. "Mr. Murphy," Charlotte said, and her voice was the careful, educated voice he had mimicked for a parlor audience 11 days ago, and she used it deliberately and without apology. "I believe you are acquainted with the name Miriam Ashby." The fire crackled once. Murphy's expression moved through confusion and into something that had no name in polite company. "She was a young woman in Bristol," Charlotte continued, "in the spring of 1788. She left behind a debt of £240, which I have been carrying since her death last autumn. She also left behind several letters, addressed to you and never sent, and a daughter who has been employed in your household for 6 weeks, without either of you knowing the other's name." She paused, precisely once. "My name is Charlotte Ashby. I believe that I am your daughter." The room did not breathe. Lady Finch's fan, which had been moving in the measured arcs of a woman in full social command, became still in her hand. The word "calculating" passed behind her eyes in a single clause, and then her certainty about how the evening would proceed unmade itself completely. Murphy's face changed. Not all at once. It changed the way old stone changes in water, slowly and by the action of something patient and pitiless. And what it changed into was not guilt, precisely, and not denial, but something that had been sitting behind his eyes for 30 years, waiting for a specific word. And the word was Bristol. He said nothing. Edmund Reeves moved. He crossed the room in 3 strides, unhurried, with the particular quality of stillness that he carried even in motion. And he came to stand beside Charlotte. Not in front of her. Beside her, so that the room received the image of 2 people occupying the same ground. "Miss Ashby," he said, and the use of her name, her correct name, without the maid's apron or the agency's notation, fell into the silence of the room like a stone into still water. He looked at her, not at the assembled company. The 14 guests received his profile. "I would consider it an honor," he said, "if you would allow me to make you known to my housekeeper at Vance Hall as my intended, whenever you are ready to leave this house, which I hope is tonight." Lady Finch made a sound, low and sharp. That was the first involuntary sound Charlotte had ever heard from her. And in the single clause of that sound was the recognition that the evening had moved entirely beyond her management. Murphy pressed one hand flat against the mantelpiece and the other against his chest, and his face was doing something that the room was not comfortable witnessing. Mrs. Calder, the Baroness who had studied the carpet during his parlor performance, leaned forward slightly in her chair with the expression of a woman who had been waiting some time for this particular reckoning. Charlotte looked at Lord Vance. She looked at him long enough to read what was there. And what was there was not performance, and not convenience, and not the easy gallantry of a man at a dinner party. What was there was the thing she had refused to trust when she first saw it. Because she had been taught, by every specific circumstance of her life, that she was not the woman a man of his position chose freely. She had been taught incorrectly. "Vance Hall," she said. "Yes." The word landed in the room quietly. It was not a triumph. It was a declaration of a particular kind of peace. Lady Finch set her fan on the cushion beside her with great care, and said nothing further that evening. She recognized, in the precise silence that followed the Earl's declaration, that the social order she had spent the evening protecting had been revised by its own highest representative, and that no amount of subsequent commentary would restore the original arrangement. Her expression held, for one visible moment, something that was not quite shame and not quite admiration, but occupied the space between them. Murphy remained at the mantelpiece while the other guests made their careful farewells and the drawing-room emptied. Charlotte waited. Agnes, who had appeared at the drawing-room door with the coffee things and had heard everything from the threshold, caught Charlotte's eye once and then disappeared back into the passage with the tact of a woman who understood perfectly well when a room needed to belong to fewer people. Murphy spoke when the last guest had gone. His voice was rougher than Charlotte had heard it, stripped of the merchant's careful social veneer. "I didn't know she was with child," he said, "when I left Bristol." "She wrote to tell you," Charlotte said. "She did not send the letter." He absorbed this with the heaviness of a man receiving a weight he had been carrying lightly for 30 years and had just been shown its true measure. "The debt," he said. £240. I will settle it." "You will," Charlotte said. "Not as a gift, as what it is." She looked at him steadily, without heat and without mercy of the soft kind. She paid it herself year by year on a seamstress's wages so that you would not be troubled by her existence. You will settle it as an accounting. Murphy closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked older than he had in the parlor an hour ago, and more real, and significantly less able to perform anything. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. "For not knowing?" "I can forgive you for not knowing," Charlotte said carefully. "I am less certain about the leaving." She paused. "But I'm not finished deciding. You may write to me at Vance Hall." She left him standing at the mantelpiece. Lord Vance was in the entrance hall, waiting with the unhurried patience of a man who had decided the outcome of the evening before it concluded and was prepared to wait as long as necessary for the formalities to resolve themselves. He had Charlotte's trunk at his feet. Agnes had packed it, apparently, without being asked, with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for something to resolve for 6 weeks. Charlotte looked at the trunk, and then at Agnes, who had materialized in the hall doorway in her good apron. "You packed it yourself," Charlotte said. "I packed it last week," Agnes said. When you came down from the study with your shawl pulled sideways and your face like that." She paused. "I only didn't know which direction it would go." Charlotte crossed the hall and held Agnes's hand briefly, both of them understanding perfectly well what was being communicated by the grip, which was something that could not be said more plainly, and did not need to be. Then she released it, and Agnes stepped back, and Charlotte turned to Lord Vance. He had been watching the exchange with the quality of attention that she had, by now, learned to read correctly. Not performance, not calculation. The specific attentiveness of a man who had made the mistake once of letting a woman in his care disappear without his intervention, and who had understood, in the library doorway at 5:30 on an October morning, that he was not going to make it again. "You observed me," she said in the hall, with the candles burning low and the night pressing at the windows. "In the library." "I did," he said. "You said nothing. I was not certain you wanted to be seen." Something in Charlotte's chest loosened at this, almost imperceptibly, the way a knot loosens when the cord is finally given enough slack. "I have spent a considerable time," she said, "not being seen." "I know," he said. "I am sorry for my part in that." She looked at him carefully. He had a face that kept things, but kept them visibly, in the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders. And she thought of Agnes's account of the slowly lowered teacup, and of his body's registered wrongness during Murphy's performance, and of the specific quality of attention he had given the room in every gathering she had observed him in, which was the attention of a man who was watching for something. He was afraid he would be too late to prevent. "Your ward," she said. "Agnes told me, eventually. The young woman you did not speak for." His expression shifted, the control remaining, but the thing beneath it becoming briefly visible. He had been 29 years old and newly come into the earldom, and he had believed that the girl's guardian would act on the evidence of the man's character that Edmund had already seen clearly. The guardian had not acted. The girl had been married to the man before the season was out, and had spent 3 years in a house that Edmund could not enter, and had written him a letter that he had kept in his coat pocket until the ink went pale. He had burned it eventually. He had not forgiven himself for the timing. "I will not stay silent," he said. Again. Charlotte regarded him for a long moment, in the hall of the house that had employed her and dismissed her and given her, entirely without intending to, the specific knowledge of who she was. Then she picked up the handle of her own trunk, and Lord Vance took it from her without comment, and with the particular gentleness of a man performing care rather than dominance. And he led her out into the October night. Vance Hall was 3 miles from Grasmere Park on a road that followed the edge of a wood and emerged onto a rise from which, in daylight, the Wiltshire landscape spread out in the particular shade of late autumn that was neither gold nor brown, but the precise color of something that had endured. In the dark, it was simply the road and the carriage lantern, and Charlotte sitting across from a man who had made a specific promise in a room full of people, and who was now, she noticed, at some pains not to crowd her, his hands folded on his knee and his attention directed out the window rather than at her, as though he understood that she had just put down a very heavy thing and might need a moment before she was ready to pick up anything else. She would tell him about the letter. Not tonight. The letter and the miniature and the account of her mother's 30 years of careful, private, uncomplaining endurance. She would tell him when she was ready. And she recognized, with some surprise, that she trusted the timing to be her own. Murphy's solicitor confirmed the household account discrepancy 3 days after Charlotte left Grasmere Park. The confirmation arrived at Vance Hall in a brief professional letter addressed to Lord Vance, who had, it emerged, taken the trouble of raising the question to the solicitor directly before the dinner gathering. The confirmation established, for any record that required establishing, that Charlotte's correction had been accurate and that her competence was not in question. Murphy wrote to Charlotte that same week. The letter ran to 4 pages and contained a great deal of honest pain and very little self-justification, which surprised her. She read it twice and left it on the writing desk in the room that Lord Vance's housekeeper had prepared for her, with the fire lit and a blue dress laid out that had belonged to the last woman in residence at Vance Hall, and that fit Charlotte with the particular precision of something that had been waiting. She wrote back. Briefly, and without resolution, because resolution of that kind was not something that could be scheduled. She told him she had received his letter. She told him she would write again in the new year. She folded her reply and sealed it, and gave it to the footman, and went downstairs to find Lord Vance standing in the entrance hall with his coat on, asking if she would like to walk. The announcement of their engagement appeared in the county paper before Christmas. Lady Finch, who read the paper at her breakfast table in her house near Devizes, set it down with great care and poured her second cup of tea, and said quietly to the window, "Well." It was the only commentary she made, and it was from a woman who had spent 60 years commenting on everything, its own form of admission. Agnes received a letter from Charlotte in the 3rd week of November, inviting her to take up a position at Vance Hall as Charlotte's personal attendant. The letter was 3 paragraphs and warm, and Agnes read it sitting on the edge of the bed in the small room at Grasmere Park, where Charlotte had once unpacked her trunk and straightened her apron and carried herself downstairs. She wrote back the same afternoon accepting. She was at Vance Hall before the first snow. The first snow came on the 12th of December, light and early, falling past the long windows of Vance Hall's parlor in the soft gray light of a Thursday morning. Charlotte was at the writing desk when it began, reading her way through the 2nd volume of the English common law history she had started in Murphy's library, no longer at dawn and no longer in secret. The fire was well made behind her. Lord Vance was at the other desk, reviewing correspondence, and they had been sitting in the same room in the same quiet for 2 hours, which Charlotte had noticed but not commented on, because the silence was the good kind, the kind that was not absence, but presence. 2 people in the same room choosing to be there. She set the book down and looked at the window. The miniature was on the mantelpiece. Murphy had sent it, wrapped in a separate letter that said only that it had belonged to the woman it depicted and ought to be with her daughter. Charlotte had placed it on the mantelpiece herself, on the right side, where the morning light caught the gilt frame and made it warm. Her mother's face looked out at the room from that position with the same precision Charlotte saw in the glass each morning, and Charlotte had found, over the preceding weeks, that she could look at it without the specific weight of not knowing pressing behind her sternum. She knew now. The knowing was complicated and incomplete, and required things of her she had not yet finished working out. The knowing was also, in the plain sense, hers. Lord Vance looked up from his correspondence. He followed her gaze to the window, where the snow was coming down in earnest now. "Cold?" he said. "Yes," Charlotte said. He rose and crossed to the hearth and added a log to the fire with the domestic ease of a man who did not require ceremony for small acts. The flame rose. He remained where he was for a moment, looking at the miniature. And then he looked at Charlotte in the particular way that she had finally allowed herself to trust. "You are warm enough?" he asked. It was a short question and a plain one, and Charlotte understood that it was asking, in the way his questions always asked, something rather larger than its surface, something that had to do with the room and the fire, and the position on the mantelpiece, and the letter in the writing desk drawer, and the 240 pounds settled, and the road she had come down, and the one she was on now. "Yes," she said. I am warm enough. Outside the window, the snow went on falling across the Wiltshire countryside, covering the road that ran from Grasmere Park in 3 patient, unhurried miles. The parlor held the fire, and the 2 desks and the gilt miniature and the quiet that had chosen them. Charlotte turned back to her book. She was home. If Charlotte's story stayed with you, leave your favorite moment in the comments below. Stories like hers have always deserved to be told.